Most activities have separate groups for different ages. And even those places you mentioned, school, even those places where we do have a real crossover, there's often a directionality to it. The teacher-pupil relationship is clearly not equal, it's not mutual. And outside of our families, there really are very few places where different ages can come together and all have the same part or place or purpose.
Welcome to Season 2 of the Roots for Churches podcast, where we'll be exploring the whole theme of intergenerational ministry. Roots publish resources to help you lead great church, and one of those resources, online and in our newly named Worship Together magazine, is a weekly outline for intergenerational worship. It's packed full of creative ideas, prayers, dramas, discussions, song suggestions, and so many ways to lead an intergenerational congregation to connect with each other and God. Alongside this, we're launching a series of articles in the newly named Worship Together magazine, out from January 2025. These are exploring the benefits and challenges of intergenerational ministry. While we provide ideas and a framework for worship and learning together each week, we wanted to unpack the why and the values behind how our weekly all-age worship service is structured. Also exploring some of the latest research and wisdom from experts who've been doing intergenerational ministry for decades. In addition to these articles, we hope you'll share these podcasts with people in your church who are leading. Check out our weekly and seasonal resources at rootsforchurches.com. Our series starts with Darren Philip, who works for the Church of Scotland, helping churches with their mission and ministry. Darren is a long-time friend of Roots. He writes for us regularly, and he is passionate about intergenerational ministry and serving in his local church. He and his colleague Susie Farrant have written a book entitled Being an Intergenerational Church, which I highly recommend and you should definitely get hold of. Thanks for joining us on the Roots for Churches podcast. Here we go. So welcome, Darren. Thanks for joining us on the Roots for Churches podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And you've got a beautiful accent, which I'm sure people will start to hear as we talk. Where are you from, Darren?
I'm from just outside of Edinburgh. I have that strange accent where people from Edinburgh think I'm from Glasgow and people from Glasgow think I'm from Edinburgh.
I mean, nobody wants you, or everybody wants you. Brilliant. Tell me, Darren, how did you get involved in church ministry? How did you get involved in intergenerational?
When I was really young, I didn't come from a family that went to church, but my parents did send me to Sunday school. So they would drop me off at the gate and then pick me up at the gate at the end. I suspect to keep my grandparents happy. And that was my kind of first experience of church. And then when I got, towards my teenage years, I disappeared for a while, and then came back maybe around the age 15, 16. The reason I mention that is because I think those early years kind of shape how I maybe see some of the intergenerational stuff now. Because on the first Sunday of each month, our church held a family service where there was no separate children's activities, but all the other kids had families to sit with. And I went on my own, so was kind of adopted by this church family and developed all of these people, many of whom I'm still in touch with, who took a real interest in my life. And I guess that was a real shaping influence on how I see what church is and what a church can be. In terms of ministry, when I left school, I trained to be a maths teacher, and then decided to do a gap year doing youth work. And the gap year has lasted almost 20 years now, and it's just never quite ended.
Oh, it's a beautiful story. I hope you get paid and you're not on a volunteer gap year for 20 years. It makes it hard to live, doesn't it? That's beautiful. I love that story about the families in church adopting you, because I think sometimes when we start talking about intergenerational ministry or church ministry, we can think about church in very sort of nuclear family ways. We can think, mum, dad, kids, they all come together. But that's not necessarily who comes to church. You've got single parents, you've got grandparents bringing grandchildren, you have people, like you said, children turning up without parents, you have young people who turn up without parents. You have parents who turn up without young people.
Yeah.
And again, all of that can feel quite awkward if we're asking people to get into family groups. So I think that, we'll come back to that, but that idea of like, what is family and who is this for? And how does church become family in the broader sense? I think that's really important to pick up on. And can we define some terms? So this is one of the first of a series of podcasts about intergenerational ministry. For those who are brand new to this, what does intergenerational mean?
So firstly, I think a generation is broadly a group of people who have grown up with the same cultural references. It's not necessarily a generation quite on a family tree. It's not necessarily people who are all exactly the same age, but maybe people who've grown up with the same world events, the same cultural reference points. And being intergenerational is intentionally bringing people from those different generations together in some sort of mutual learning, worshipping, serving as part of what it is to be church together.
I'm thinking through my life and the various settings I'm in. I can't think of that many settings in our modern world where we are intergenerational. Maybe besides at home with a family, where I'm at home with my kids, or maybe grandparents come to have a meal with us. There just aren't very many settings. I suppose school is intergenerational on one level because teachers are a different generation than the children. But a lot of what we do in our culture, we separate everybody out into age groups.
Yeah. Most activities have separate groups for different ages. And even those places, you mentioned school, even those places where we do have a real crossover, there's often a directionality to it. There's the teacher-pupil relationship is clearly not equal, it's not mutual. Outside of our families, there really are very few places where different ages can come together and all have the same part or place or purpose.
Yes, that's true. And I would have thought church historically was quite intergenerational, but has become less so. What 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 has shaped the current, culture or shape of church that we've got now? Why have we ended up sort of everybody split off into their separate groups? Because that's not really how I imagine it in the Bible. Like you kind of see more intergenerational things in the Bible.
Yeah, even going all the way back to the time of Moses, when the church is described as gathering, the people of God gather, and it mentions that there were men, women, children, and little ones. So, it's kind of painting this picture of everybody being there. And when I think of the early church in Acts meeting in people's homes, well, whoever was in that home made up the nucleus of a congregation. And that would have been multiple generations, I would imagine. And even in my own denomination, the Church of Scotland, if you go back through historic records, it was until fairly recently that church worship was something that all ages attended together. Maybe weren't as good as the inter bit because it was very much directional, but it was something that all ages did together until the 1800s, really, when the Sunday school movement began. And it began as a movement in general education to help people to read and to write, with a desire that they would be able to read the scriptures for themselves. And then over time, it became to be more of a focused religious activity as the state took on more of the general education. And I think we had the best of intentions in then further segregating the ages. A lot of church growth strategies suggest that having people who are of a similar demographic together is a good way to stimulate growth. So the idea that you had children's church, a youth church, an adult church, an older people's church gained quite a lot of traction in the 60s and 70s. And similarly, people were concerned, I think, that church maybe wasn't the most engaging for younger generations. You know, they were becoming more used to school being something interactive and hands-on, learning through doing, and there was a desire to create the same environment for them. And so I think more and more of our church activities over the last 50, 60 years have become boxed into different age groups.
And as you say, all from a heart to actually connect with people, a heart to do mission, a heart to, reach out. I think some of it is like marketing. Everything in our culture is marketed. If you've ever done any marketing, they're like, who's your target? How can we communicate specifically to this group? Which kind of social media will they be on? What kind of programs will they watch? Where will I advertise? It's so targeted. And so that the messaging can be really bespoke. And on one level, that is fantastic. But as you say, it separates people into these little segments and chunks, which I think can also make us quite even more self-centered, that everything is catered to me. I don't have to tolerate advertising that's not for me. Even, if you go on Facebook, it says, is this ad of interest? You can tell it to stop showing it to you. So it can tailor it even better to you. And I think we get almost intolerant of things that aren't perfect for us. We switch the radio station. We just swap over. We find a different book to read. We find a different church to attend that caters to our needs, because we're so used to having things just for us and our particular needs. And yeah, I think it makes us subconsciously, it makes us have a less attention span or a less willingness to engage with other people and their needs. And I 100% agree that church, probably in the 1800s and even sometimes now, doesn't cater to younger people in the same way that it caters to the older people. Now, some people might say, hang on a minute, my church is all about the young people and there's nothing for me. But yeah, I do think that sort of framework has shaped how we have designed church or how we make decisions. And so this idea of intergenerational, it's trying to confront that or make us challenge those presuppositions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about recognizing that there's something we can all learn and all offer to one another when we come together. And it's not to say there isn't a space for us to still have these separate times, but that the core of who we are as church is about togetherness and seeing, that we are all different parts of the one body. And it's not a call to try and make it uniform or all the same, but rather to recognise the place of all, and that we all need and depend on each other, and that God speaks through all of us, regardless of our age. And I think bringing the generations together can help us to rediscover something quite special and quite unique in the world that we can offer one another.
So can we come back to this word you used, directionality? I just think that's an interesting thing to unpack, that in church often we have somebody who's been to theological college or who's done youth work training or is a children's worker, or the volunteer who's been through the process and been vetted, and then they therefore get the microphone or get the majority of the airtime to express what they're saying, and the rest of us have come to learn, and we sit at their feet, as it were, and absorb what they've got. And I've been reading some stuff around teaching models, and you hinted at it when you talked about the way that children are taught now is different, that there's a lot more interaction, discovery, conversation and discussion. But I think most of us still have in our heads that we come to church to learn. We're expecting a directionality, either from God to us or from a minister or a volunteer who's leading it to us, and we come to absorb. And maybe the things that we give are our worship and our money, but we're not expecting to come to church and bring our own thoughts or theological contributions, perhaps. We're expecting to receive that and go away with more knowledge or more understanding. And I think maybe you're, with this directionality thing, you're saying something different to us. Can you help unpack some of that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we largely almost have this a kind of consumer model of church where we come along and we receive. And like you say, there might be specific points where you're asked to offer, some praise or money or prayers or something in return. But by and large, my experience of church has been quite passive. And it's been where there's been someone in authority, whether that's as a child, it was a Sunday school teacher. As an adult, it might be a minister or a local preacher or a worship leader. But there's been this sense that quite often my role has been to sit and receive in one. But again, just going back to accounts of the early church and so on, it's not the feel that I get from them. It feels much more a sense that it was expected that everyone would be able to fully participate and that everyone had something to offer. And I think there's much more of a leveling there. And so when I speak about removing directionality, I'm not for a moment suggesting we remove these really important roles that people have, these callings and vocations to specific ministries, but rather that we recognise that everyone in the church family has something that they can offer, and that we can shape how we are church together in a way to enable everyone to participate, because God can use any and all of us in all sorts of ways. And I'm just concerned that we don't put barriers in the way of that.
Yes, I agree. So many people will have sort of said, well, our churches have had a go at this, or we try to do this. We have the young people in for the first part of the service, if there are any young people, or we do an all-age service once a month. Talk us through sort of a journey of like moving a church to becoming more intergenerational. I know you've written a whole book with Susie Farron on this, being an intergenerational church, but how do we move from sort of these gestures that sort of happen every so often of like, oh, it'd be good to do this together, to really having intergenerational, that participation, that valuing each other at its heart, more than just sort of these fragmented every so often moments? How do we have that as a true value in our churches?
I think it's as much an ethos as it is a particular activity. It's about how you view what goes on in church and thinking through how could we maximise who can contribute to this and who can participate in this. And I think lots of what churches do already has the potential to be really intergenerational. If we just set it up and frame it and are a bit more intentional about doing that in the right way. You know, churches are great at doing conversation over tea and coffee. And that can be a great place to engage all generations in the conversations of faith. It maybe just means shifting slightly the furniture, shifting how we serve, changing what we serve and how we do it. Lots of what we offer in our worship times really lends itself without much tweaking to participation from all ages. So I think on the one hand, just making little changes to make this part of the rhythm of who we are, rather than a one-off event or a separate service that happens at another time. In my own church, almost 15 years ago now, we were part of a union where several churches came together. And we thought a big change in church life like that was the moment when we could try something different. So we began doing a very intentional time of intergenerational worship every week, so that it wasn't just the one-off event. And the way we did that was by gathering a mixed group of ages, and allowing them to plan and lead the worship every week. And our role, I was on the ministry team at the time, and our role was to support these groups in doing that. So we ended up with 3 groups that would meet. They would take a month at a time, so it gave you quite a nice rhythm of spending a month planning, a month leading, and then a month rest. And they would meet sometimes in an evening. Some of them would meet on a Friday afternoon when the local schools finished early, as that allowed more children and young people to participate. And they would sit with whatever the gospel reading in the lectionary was for that week, come up with ideas, just discussing the passage. What stood out to you? What does it mean to you? And then we used the Roots Adult and All Age magazine to put together some ideas, and then they led the worship every week. And we still had a separate children's group and so on, but that all happened afterwards. And we also introduced the equivalent groups for adults, so that learning became very intentionally seen as a lifelong thing, not just for one age group. And that's evolved over time. They don't have that separation anymore either. But I think what mattered there was a recognition that everyone has insights to offer. And that was just one model of how we put that together. I've worked with several churches who've used very different ways of putting all age input into worship and learning. But we used the excuse of a change in how and when we were meeting as church to be the catalyst for that change.
Talk me through that all-age planning group, because I think that the dynamics of that would be really interesting. Like how, now maybe you just get very confident children who are quite happy to voice their opinion, but I can imagine culturally, if you've grown up in church and you've often been told by the minister what to do, if you sat in a meeting with the minister and the minister was saying to, I don't know, an 8-year-old or a 13-year-old, what do you think we should do on Sunday? I mean, depends on the child or young person. Some of them might be full of ideas and quite outspoken. But how do you actually create that planning space that really gives equal voice to the different generations and equal value to their contribution?
I mean, it took us a while to get that right. And it took us a while to really find a way for children in particular to meaningfully contribute to that. Because you're absolutely right about having the minister there creates a dynamic, but also they quite often had a parent or grandparent in the room as well and would defer to them. So we found that food really helps. So doing it over a meal and making it less structured, it wasn't so much here's the agenda we need to get through, but rather, let's just read a story and have a conversation about it together and see where it goes. And then over time, the ministry team actually pulled back further and further from it, and the group would have someone within itself who was appointed to take all of these ideas and go away and try and write it up and help shape it into something a bit more structured. So yeah, I think it was just keeping it relaxed and as free flowing as possible, so that we tried not to make it feel like a Bible study or a lesson or something,
or a planning
but just
meeting.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah, we tried to make it
fun.
just like a group of friends who happened to be different ages talking about a story and seeing where God led us through that.
That's brilliant. And then when it comes to a Sunday, did that planning group then lead different aspects of the service, or was it all delivered by one person?
No, it would usually be led by that group who had put it together. So again, intentionally showing that worship, that this style of worship was a collaborative thing. The word liturgy originally means work of the people, and that was kind of our ethos, that what we offer to God is the work of the whole community.
I like that. That's beautiful. So one of the things I'd like to unpack is how some of these little steps you mentioned before, little things that we're already doing, but we could make them more intergenerational. So, for example, a church might have some creative art stuff happening during sung worship, sort of at the same time, or how can we make that more intentionally intergenerational or participative? I mean, in my experience of leading church, to me, a lot of this is about how the person leading the gathering is actually framing it, how you introduce it, what you call it. If you call it craft, people have a certain mentality of like, I don't do craft. If you call it art, certain people are like, oh, I'm not very good at art. And and people immediately count themselves out. If you say we're drawing, people say, oh, that's for children. It's tricky to actually frame these things in a way that people count themselves in. But I think part of it is about inviting and modeling. And I used to do strategic things like go and get certain adults who I know would do stuff and say, come down to this part of the church and do this. So it models that this is not just for children, that everybody is involved in this. And particularly with creative art and doing collaborative artwork, I think it's really helpful to have like an artist sort of facilitating different people's contributions so that it does invite adults, children, people of all ages to engage with that. But do you have some suggestions of how people can frame some of these really simple things that we might do in church and make them more intergenerational?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head already. I think our language is so important. And the mindset that lies behind that language is really important. That's one of the things we really struggled to overcome, was the thought that we're using Play-Doh to do this, therefore it must be a children's activity. And the number of times that it would be introduced in such a way, if any of the children would like to come and do this, and yet I know there's a room full of adults who would rather be doing that than any of the other ways of engaging. And I equally know that I was the child who quite enjoyed listening to a sermon and would rather have done that than go out to the Sunday school many weeks. So recognising that we connect to God in different styles, and that those aren't dependent on our age.
Indeed, yeah.
I think is really important. And sometimes there can be a sense when you're being intergenerational that you need to keep spoken things as short as possible. But I think when you're setting up and introducing something, the opposite can be true. Taking just an extra minute to explain what it is that you're inviting people to do and how that can help them connect with God, I think can open that way. And then my favourite technique you've already mentioned is planting some people who will come forward and do it, of a mixture of ages, encouraging, because it's permission giving. As soon as someone sees someone else like them do it, they realise. And we've found that the first 2 or 3 times you do something, it's really hard to get people to participate. But once you move beyond that, once you've done it for the 4th, maybe 5th time, suddenly people start finding, I've really engaged with that, and they're really keen to do it again.
And sometimes I think it's about making it mandatory. We're all going to do this, and then people who would never have come up and done some, I don't know, draw around your hand and cut it out and stick it. They would think, oh, that is for the kids. But actually, when we all do it, and some people will grumble internally or externally, but there is that process of like, actually, as they do it, they meet with God, or there's something about doing something kinesthetic that really connects with them spiritually. And they're like, I didn't think I would have liked that, but actually I did. And then the next time it's offered as an option, then they're like, oh, I might try it. So there is sometimes of forcing people politely and gently.
Yeah, and I think when you get to that space that people are confident, you can offer, if your space allows for it, you can offer multiple ways of engaging. And again, I know of a congregation in the west of Scotland who they have 4 corners, and they are for head, heart, hands, and feet. And that, so every week, they offer 4 ways of engaging with the scripture. And so head will be something that might involve reading or writing or listening. Heart will be something a bit quieter, a bit more meditative. Hands will be where you might find your crafty type activities, but without calling them that. And feet is more a sort of practical action that you do out in the world somewhere. But it gives them the flexibility to encourage people to try a couple of different ones. There's clearly an expectation that everyone engages in some way. There's the language thing of not defining it with an age-specific language term, but also it gives them the opportunity to encourage people. This week, why don't you try going to one that you don't usually go to and just see what happens?
That's good. And I think also we have to break down a sort of mentality that we can have in church about what does it mean to pay attention, or what does it mean to focus. So we have a very, I would say, traditional understanding of paying attention, which is sitting still, looking at the person who's talking and not making any noise yourself, and ideally not fidgeting. Now, I think we all know we're becoming more familiar with neurodiversity, but all of us as well, we do other things also to help us pay attention. So I have a child who plays with a fidget, and actually all that fidgeting helps her engage. We have people who sit and knit in church. Why? Because doing something with their hands helps them not chat and helps them pay attention. Other people can't sit still, and so they pace at the back of the church. Now, is that okay? I think it's great because they're there. We used to have a Lego table out, and some people got annoyed because Lego, when the kids are raking it through the big tough spot, it makes quite a bit of noise. And they're like, they're not paying attention, they're just building. But actually, a lot of those kids would stay in the gathering, listening, engaging with worship, singing. They'd be singing the worship songs while fiddling with Lego and building things. And I just think sometimes our concept of what does it actually look like when somebody is engaging with God or praying, you can't always tell. I just remember that story. We had it in a writing conference recently. Hannah, and she's going to the temple at Shiloh, and Eli sees her praying and he thinks she's drunk, just because of the way she's praying. And that sort of challenge of like watching somebody else engage with God, we can judge. We can be like, they're not doing it right. They're not praying right. They're not engaging. They look like they're on their phone. They're therefore not engaging. And you're like, well, do you know what? God knows their heart. And I think the invitation can be, what are you doing to connect with God right now? Is what you're doing helping you connect? We can say that from the front and encourage people to try things and, push in a bit more and nudge children and adults together to say, is what you're doing right now helping you engage? What would help you connect? But not judging the external of it. And I think that's the thing. Like, somebody might be sitting on a craft table having a chat with somebody and it doesn't look like they're engaging, but maybe that connection brings them back to church the following week because they felt cared for. It just doesn't always look like sitting and listening and doing the task exactly how we might have planned it.
Yeah. And it's going back to using that family imagery. If you think of family gatherings where you've got multiple generations, children, parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents, there will be someone who is cooking and someone who's on a device and someone who's fidgeting with something, but everyone is still connecting with one another and all part of it. And I also think those of us who lead worship or are in positions of leadership need to remember to let go a little bit of something. I'm sure every preacher will have had the experience of someone at the church door saying, thank you for when you said X. That really meant something to me. And you're smiling and nodding, thinking, I never said that at all. But because it's God that's at work in them, and they received from God in a way that was really meaningful to them. And so I think just letting go of the strings a little bit and recognising that God works through all of these means.
And all of these people who are gathered, not just the person at the front.
Yeah.
And I think that part of the beauty of intergenerational ministry is that we receive from it permissions and revalues, or like, I feel like it's just elevating again the value of all these other people who come to church, who actually know God and have been praying in the week, or who are reading the scripture themselves. They're all contributing. They're all connecting. Just in the little discussions that might happen, they say, you turn to the person next to you and talk about this. Those moments of connection where you see it's not just the person at the front who's heard from God, it's the person beside me who is struggling with it like me, or who has connected, and that is inspiring. Or the young person who sees it totally differently than you, or the person who's new to faith who doesn't understand it and makes you look at it fresh again. It's all really beautiful, isn't it? That participation. And I think yeah, I think it is kind of unpicking some of that idea of like, what does it mean to learn? That we're not a blank slate that somebody clever has got to write on.
Mm-hmm.
That actually we come with some understanding already, and this is about adding new bits and connections that create more meaning, and allowing God to rewrite certain bits of it or add to. And I think that new framework of understanding how we learn then shapes how we shape learning and worshipping in church.
Yeah, I think so much of the teaching of Jesus happened while he was walking. You know, whether that's parables out with the disciples or explaining the scriptures on the road to Emmaus or whatever. So much happened while they were on the journey from one place to another. And I think there's a significant lesson in there about learning. You know, that it doesn't need to be a formal me to you thing, but by journeying together, by doing life together, we're all learning from one another.
Yeah, it's that in conversation. That Jesus, a lot of it was the question asking, and
Yeah,
him asking the question back, not always answering, but asking them further questions. That do we have space for puzzling it out together, rather than presenting a polished, finished product that
yeah,
we just consume? Because I just think it's a bit pre-digested that way, and it's probably there is something. It's not got spiritual fiber to it. It needs. We need a bit more roughage to actually do good to us. And I think, as much as I love a really excellent sermon, I try to preach them myself. Try and come up with something insightful and memorable. Sometimes the more powerful learning is stuff that you've wrestled through and you haven't been able to understand for weeks. And probably that's why Jesus taught in parables, so that we had to keep coming back to it and unpacking it and puzzling over it, because our brains hang on to things that are unresolved much longer than things that are neatly packaged.
yeah. And it's a great gift of the church community to recognise that lots of people are living with those same questions, and it's okay to live with the questions.
Yeah, definitely. So if you were talking to a church leader who has sort of heard about intergenerational ministry and is thinking, I could do more, I think this is a good idea, but we've got a really good children's group in our church, I don't think we should stop that. But what would you sort of say, what are some sort of quick wins or easy things to do? Or if you were sort of advising a friend who came to you and said, what can we do to get started on this intergenerational journey, what would you say?
I think start where you are. Your church context and my church context will be very, very different. So start where you are, and look for opportunities to bring all generations together in that mutual space, in a way that allows everyone to have an equal part and place. And for some churches, that might start with worship, but in many places, worship might be the hardest thing and might be the last thing you come to look at. Maybe looking at hospitality and how you can eat together. Maybe if your church has a gardening project or something like that everyone can find a little part to do, and as you do it together, you can talk and you can have these conversations and you can build these connections. One of the things I think that is really significant is timing. If you sit down and look at your church calendar and when things are on, and then look at what typical working patterns are in your area and what school hours are in your area, many churches are surprised at how many people you're excluding just because everything happens at the same time. When there might only be one section of the community who's generally available at that time. So looking at not beginning everything at 7:30 when lots of parents are already trying to put their kids to bed, but shifting the timing of it, or not doing as much or everything during the school day, and finding ways to fit in with the pattern of people's lives, I think can really open up to all ages a lot more, just as a practical place to start.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I think the way that our society is organised is that, you know, the children do the school, and then there's this little window of a million after school clubs and play dates and all those sort of things, and then quick, get them home fed and into bed, and then the adults do their just adult things in the evening. And yeah, it can feel like, again, like our schedules segregate us from other generations.
Yeah.
Um,
There's an opportunity there as well for the church, I think. I was working with a church where they had lost a number of their children and young people to a local swimming club that started meeting at the same time that church was on. And they were really lamenting this. But as you spoke, you could see that these young people were so important to them as part of their church family. And I said, well, rather than lament that they're not here, maybe some of you could go and support them at their swimming gala. And that's another way of being church, is recognizing that it's not all about who gathers in a specific place at a specific time, but it's about sharing the whole of life and faith together. And sometimes that might mean actually breaking out of our usual patterns to go and support people where they're at and where their busy life is the rest of the time.
And I can imagine those young people feeling cared for and loved by the people in their church because they showed up to support them. If they're going to come back to church, they're going to feel loved, and they will.
Yeah.
And as it is, that we don't always have to. Church isn't just the certain hour on a Sunday where church gathers. Church is all the people and the relationships in between times as well. And so it, as you say, breaking our mindset of this is when we do it.
Yeah.
This is the time when we gather, and it's like, well, yes, but also we also do gather and connect and share in all these other times and places. So you talked about hospitality, you talked about eating together, you talked about worshipping together. What can we do to make worship truly intergenerational? Because I think in many churches, it's a lot of people standing, facing towards an organ or a band on a stage and singing into the back of somebody else's head. Yeah, it is intergenerational in the sense that it's more multi-generational. There's different generations in the room, perhaps. There might even be a song that is for the kids, a kids' song with some actions. Is that what we mean by intergenerational worship?
I think in a lot of these contexts, what is missing is the inter bit of the word. They've got the generations, but there's not the opportunity to interact across them and between them. And sometimes that's a limitation of the physical space, because, as you say, we might be sat in rows of fixed pews and so on, and actually shifting the space of how we meet can really change how we worship. We set our church differently every Sunday depending on the story, but more often than not, the kind of default has become a circle, and it's amazing how much that has enhanced the singing apart from anything, but how engaged that can make everyone. You can have small children playing on the floor, crawling about, but they're still part of everything. It's become a lot more accessible because the seats are easier to get to for people who use walking aids and things like that. I get that not every church will be able to do that, but there are ways that you can shape the space that you have by encouraging people to turn to someone behind them and say good morning, by asking people to join hands for a particular activity, or maybe look around as they say a response or sing a particular song. There are ways that we can just create little opportunities for engagement, and then building on that is moving it from engagement to interaction. So where are the opportunities for people to play together, to pray together, to create together, to talk together? It could be something as simple as a question that you discuss with those around you. But I think for me, that's what changes something from just having multiple generations present to have them really being intergenerational, is finding those opportunities for people to share, interact, and really connect between one another, not just always through the person at the front.
I like that. I like those words: pray, play, create, talk together. And I think again, there's that value, and I think it might need some unpicking, that sort of subconsciously we think that certain things have more spiritual value, like the singing the worship song, the sermon, and maybe some praying. Those are really important. And the icebreaker question is not so important, or the discussion that happens in pairs is not so important, or perhaps, as you said, playing together is not as important. But surely they must be, because, you know, I just think probably our brains need a reset, or a theological reevaluation of why is play so important? Why is these points of connection where it doesn't seem overtly spiritual, but why are those so important? My guess is it's something to do with it connects us to ourselves, it connects us to our communities, it stops us being individual in our faith.
Yeah, we're made in the image of a creative God, so that sense of creativity and playfulness, I think, is part of our nature and part of who we are. And the things that are often seen as important, whether that's the singing or the preaching or prayers, are often all quite intellectual activities, and that's partly what skews them towards a more adult audience, but also excludes many adults for whom that's just not for them. And I think a really important part of recognising the visual, the tactile elements, many of which were lost at the Reformation in this part of the world, but rediscovering the use of all our senses in worship, I think can help re-engage people for whom faith isn't just an intellectual pursuit, but an experienced reality. And all of these sorts of activities help people to experience God. And if that doesn't work for you, if you're thinking, well, that's just not for me, that's fine, that's okay. You're maybe like me, and you do have that more cerebral connection to faith. But I think essential to the intergenerational ethos is recognising the diversity within that, and that all of these things are needed so that we're not excluding everyone.
It's so powerful. And also, I think it helps us live out our faith in the day to day. So we can almost compartmentalize spiritual life into when I'm in that sort of cerebral headspace, when I'm thinking about God, when I'm actually consciously praying, when I'm directing my worship to God. But if that playful, relational, creative space is also part of connecting with God and worship, well, then what I do in my day to day, when I'm washing dishes, when I'm playing with my children, when I'm walking the dog, those suddenly become spiritual activities where God can interrupt more regularly. And so again, it isn't just that we need to make we need to break down our mindset in church of like what can be sacred and where can we connect with God. But I think that mindset change then impacts our discipleship in the day to day and allows people to live more connected to God everywhere they go. Yeah. And any other ideas for moving people from into that more interspace, as you call it? So we've talked about worship. What about talks and preaching? Are there ways to make that more intergenerational? I think most of us have this concept of, it's 20 minutes, if you're lucky, might be longer, 3 points that all begin with the same letter and a poem to finish. And depending on your tradition, prayer ministry or an altar call, or everybody sits in silence and contemplates. But how do we make that part of a service intergenerational?
I think there can be multiple ways you could approach that. I think we've already spoken about having other ways of engaging. So maybe there's something that people could play with, draw, write down their thoughts. There could be something that people actually helps them digest what is being said. I think there are different ways of presenting preaching that doesn't have to just be a lone voice. Having it as an interview, a conversation like this between two people, suddenly just invites a slightly more relational way into it. The preparation of a sermon could happen with multiple ages, even if it's still just being led with one person. You could involve different people, so that there are different insights that connect with different generations, all in the one. David Sinos, who is familiar to many people in Roots, he speaks of crowdsourcing a sermon. That idea that you live with the text you're preaching for a whole week, as you engage with different ages through life, and you draw all of that into it, so that what comes out has been shaped by all ages. Using, I know some people really would stick to a sermon just being an auditory event, but you can use visuals alongside it, which just engages a whole set of people in a different way. You can break it up rather than making it one long chunk. You could break it up with some other activity or some singing, which can give people a chance for things to, brew within them as it goes through. The possibilities are endless. I'm always quite keen to make sure we don't lose that aspect of who we are, but without in any way trying to guard what we think it is, to not limit our possibilities of how we believe God might speak to people through the preaching of the word, whatever that might look like. And when people are skeptical about can you do this, can you engage all ages in this one thing, I always think go and watch a Pixar film or Illumination, or name your film house, because it can be engaged with by so many ages on so many levels. There's stuff that's really deep that can engage parents who go and watch these films, that will go over the top of the heads of the kids, but the kids will hear something completely different. And I think if Disney can do it, then surely the church can do it too.
Yes. And I think part of why they're good at it is they've got lots of people working together to make it happen. It can feel quite daunting on one minister trying to, shape this all-age talk. And I think sometimes we're a bit ambitious as well. I think one of the keys of communicating to all ages is actually clarifying your message, like boiling it down to saying, what is the main thing I want to say? And then saying that really well. Because if you think back over your life, you've probably heard many brilliant sermons, but you probably can't remember the content.
No.
At all. And you come away going, wow, that was really good. I really learned something, but you can't remember it. But if you've seen a really engaging, whether it's a magician or something, you can probably still remember it, probably because it was visual, it was out, it sort of had a sense of surprise, or I can still, all the sermons I remember, I have amazing object lessons or something surprising happening in the middle of them. And they weren't trying to make 10 points or 3 points or have a poem. The alliteration helps for the day that you can remember it, but not long term.
Yeah.
But the visual impact of one simple object lesson, a bit like the parables that Jesus tells, that sort of story, it sticks, doesn't it? And I think sometimes we have I don't want to say it's wrong, but we have a very academic expectation of preaching and teaching in church. And as you say, it's quite cerebral. And I think there's a place for it. I love, a good meaty theological podcast or something like that. But I'm not sure that that's the place for it on a Sunday morning with everybody gathered. Yeah. I want to be impacted together with my family and meet with God, and almost provoked to go away and study it on my own to a deeper level in different contexts or in a Bible study with other people. Yeah,
and if our worship does that, then it's really something quite special.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
People. I don't think people necessarily remember what they hear, but they do remember how they feel, and I think there's an ancient truth in there. If you go all the way back to ancient church history, the Second Helvetic Convention said the preaching of the Word of God is the Word of God. The idea that it's not just the words we hear, but actually that Jesus is present with us in that moment. And I think that was recognising that inner feeling, that it's not so much about the words of the preacher, it's not so much about the learning that's put over, it's about recognising the presence of Christ in us and within us and between us as that happens. And I think if we rediscover that, it maybe takes some of the burden off people who preach a little bit, that it's not all down to you. And as you say, I think what we can learn from elsewhere is that doing these things collaboratively, I think can help create those moments where people encounter God.
It's really powerful. And I think I want to sort of sum up our time together by talking about this idea of both and. This idea that intergenerational ministry in some ways is the best of both worlds, isn't it? It's that you we're bringing teaching, but we're also bringing the relationship, where we're being playful and we're having fun, but we're also connecting with God. That it allows all these things to happen kind of simultaneously, and it's that recognizing the diversity among the people in our church, and celebrating that and allowing them to contribute. And I think anybody who's felt like, oh, I really mattered, it made a difference that I was there, wants to come back, wants to come again. Anybody who sees, any young person who walks into a church and sees young people leading things is going to be like, this is interesting. I want to know more. So I think there's something about that. The power of intergenerational is that it draws people in to each other and to God. But we're definitely not saying in any way that if you've got a vibrant children's or youth work or an adult Bible study that is absolutely rocking it and people are loving it, that you should stop it. Like, please don't. Please carry on. God's Spirit's on it. Go for it. But where we are gathered, I think we're saying, where we're gathered together and there's this opportunity for intergenerational ministry, please make the little tweaks, frame it, do your best to create more as you were saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Darren, for your time, giving us your wisdom. And before you go, I would like to hold up your book so that people who are watching the video can see it, although it might be backwards. Who knows how the screen works? Darren and Susie have written this amazing book. I have read and engaged with this. It's really, really good. It's called Being an Intergenerational Church, Practices to Bring Generations Back Together. And lots more ideas from Darren and Susie on ways that churches can be more as it were. Anything else you want to say or sign off with, Darren?
If people don't know where to begin, they just want to open up a conversation. To go alongside the book, Susie and I have created a board game. And so the idea is you can use this in your church leadership. You can use it with families that you know. You can use it in any way. And it's just very simple questions that open up a discussion, so that you can begin hearing what different generations have to feed into this conversation. And I'm sure we can make the link to that available to people.
Yeah, it's great. So it's free and people can just print a copy. I played it at a conference I was at recently. It's quite good fun. You can take any amount of time you want, but we got really into it and wanted to play for hours. It was really good. So we'll put the link in the show notes so that people can download that. And Darren has also written an article in our Adult and All Age magazine, Intergenerational Ministry. So I'd encourage you to read that when that comes out, and we'll put the link for that in the show notes as well. Thank you, Darren.
Thank you.
It's been great. Cheers.
Roots publish a huge range of resources for churches. To explore all our weekly, topical and seasonal content, as well as helpful articles, images and illustrations, you can take out a free 1-month digital trial at rootsforchurches.com. Whether you follow the Revised Common Lectionary Bible readings each week, Common Worship, or perhaps your church has your own preaching plan going through a book or topic, you can find resources for pretty much any Bible reading. Just search our website by Bible passage to find intergenerational services, Bible notes, sermon ideas, toddler, children and youth sessions, and so much more. We know you're committed to your church community changing lives, and you've got a lot on your plate. So whether you need ideas to inspire or a structure to follow, we've got you covered. Roots for Churches, resources you can trust. If you've been helped or inspired by this podcast, please subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And we'd love it if you could share it with your friends and leave us a comment or review. Together we can grow. Thanks.